William Hawley is a doctoral candidate in history at Arizona State University and an instructor of history at Northland Pioneer College. He's also a recipient of a Historical Society grant. His research examines the intersections of tourism, land use, and indigenous rights in the American Southwest, with a heavy focus on northern Arizona. William will defend his dissertation for the benefit of the mountain, tourism, and the San Francisco Peaks. And in fact, didn't I just hear him say that he did that? He defended his dissertation yesterday. For the benefit of the mountain, tourism, at the San Francisco Peaks, and the soul of the community in the fall of 2023. So that's all done now. So please welcome William Hawley.
I told Mary just a minute ago that when I submitted this PowerPoint, I put PhD on there, and I went, oh man, I hope I didn't just jinx myself. I'm happy to be here today. I wish I could have been here for the whole conference. I've been seeing the photos on social media, and it's looked wonderful, but as you heard, I was in the Valley yesterday defending my dissertation, so I had a few other things going on, and everything just kind of aligned all together. So, as you can see, yes, I'm going to be talking about this intersection with the Grand Canyon and the San Francisco Peaks, and how this all came together when we're talking about indigenous land rights and requests of indigenous people to have a say in co-management of these lands. Awesome. So in 1971, sites sacred to indigenous peoples across the Four Corners region were in danger. In Utah, southern Utah, Rainbow Bridge was in danger of being flooded by Lake Powell. And if you aren't familiar with Rainbow Bridge, it's a site sacred to the Navajo, Hopi, Paiute, a few other tribes as well. Also in 1971, in spring, the National Park Service and United States Forest Service were making plans to expand the Grand Canyon National Park and increasing tourism activities at the San Francisco Peaks. If you're unfamiliar with the Peaks, which I'm imagining most of us are, those are north of Flagstaff. That's where the Arizona Snow Bowl is today, as it was then. But at this time, there was a developer, a man named Bruce Ledbetter from Flagstaff, and he had a large parcel of property in Hart Prairie, just to the south, or not to the south, just below the Snow Bowl. Bruce Ledbetter had experience in Aspen and developing ski resorts, and his whole proposal was to make what was called the Snow Bowl Village, an Aspen-style resort community at the San Francisco Peaks. So these things all kind of converged, as well as with an increased legal framework for indigenous peoples to fight against some of these issues, these development things that affected sites that were important to them in the early 1970s. And the common thread in all these things I'm talking about, the Grand Canyon, Rainbow Bridge, the San Francisco Peaks, was one organization. And now I took a little bit of Navajo when I was a freshman at NAU, but I was not great at it, so I'm not going to try and butcher that name. It translates loosely to something about working for the people. We call it DNA. And this is a legal aid service society that was set up with federal funds in 1966 to help Native peoples on and off reservation with education issues, criminal issues, divorces, things of that nature. And for 5 years, that's all they did. That's all DNA did. But in 1971, they were thrust into basically land law. And it was all because of the movements of a few certain people. So a brief history of DNA. It's with the development of better roads in the 1960s in northern Arizona, you had increased contact with Native peoples and what we call border towns today, like Flagstaff, Winslow, where I live, Farmington, New Mexico, Gallup, New Mexico. And with increased contact, there was benefits for both, and there were negatives. Benefits is economic activity, and Native peoples could buy better cars, access to better food, things of that nature, sell their products, their art products, for a better price. The negatives, though, is some unscrupulous business people gouged them on their pawn or on their car loans. And then there was also increased contact with law enforcement. When you have this increased contact and this increased conflict, there's going to be legal issues arise, and that's where DNA came into play. The need for legal assistance was acknowledged as early as the 50s, especially among the Navajo. However, a lack of funding for lawyers really hurt the Indian people from getting the assistance that they needed. As I mentioned, in 1966, the U.S. Office of Economic Opportunity stepped in, established this program. Originally, it was called the Office of Navajo Economic Opportunity Legal Aid and Defender Society. I think that's more of a mouthful than the Navajo name, but that's just me. DNA, though, as it was then named, immediately began assisting low-income Indigenous peoples in legal matters. And what started as a way to help these lower-income people quickly evolved to assist in matters, like I said, including civil rights and land rights. So how did DNA get involved in all these things? Well, let's start with a trader, William Bill Beaver. Bill Beaver first came to Flagstaff in 1949. And after a decade of collecting and selling native pottery especially, but other native art items, he opened his own trading post in 1960. This was the Sacred Mountain Trading Post. It's closed now, but if it still exists, the building's still there. If you drive down 89 from Cameron, it's just to the south of the entrance to Wapatki. It's still there, and I use this picture because in 1969 it played a role in the movie Easy Rider. So that is a still from the film right there. Bill Beaver was also married to a Navajo woman named Dolly. She was from Loop. And together they ran this trading post until his death in 2009. But here's the thing with Bill Beaver. Unlike some trading post operators, that wasn't his main thing. He was a lover of the art. Yes, he made money off of it. But his whole thing was he wanted to be a friend to the Native peoples. And he also wanted to advocate for them in these issues. And in 1971, upon learning actually first about the Grand Canyon expansion and then an NAU proposal to build a telescope at the top of Agassiz Peak, he wrote to Barry Goldwater. And in this letter, he said that this was holy ground not only to the Hopi, but the Navajo, Apache, and the numerous Pi peoples. And he said, quote, "They resent any more desecration of their religious area and hope nothing more is done on that mountain." Barry Goldwater wrote back a very short, "Thank you, we'll look into this." However, Beaver wasn't satisfied with that, and he tracked down, he knew about DNA, and he tracked down a new attorney, Ben Hufford. Oh, that's the wrong button. I'm so used to using my own computer, sorry. So who's Ben Hufford? Well, Ben Hufford was a newly graduated lawyer from the University of Cincinnati. He had been hired to work at the DNA Tuba City office in February of 1971. Beaver went to Ben Hufford in the fall of I'm getting confused here, March of 1971. 2 months, he'd only been there like a month, maybe two. And he said, "Hey, I need your help because the Grand Canyon is proposing to expand into some areas, and the Navajo people especially are really concerned about this." According to Hufford, I actually, when in the course of my research, I was able to speak with Ben Hufford. He's still alive. He still runs a law firm in Flagstaff. According to him, Beaver informed him that these master plans for the peaks, for the Grand Canyon, were all being prepared without taking into consideration any of the religious views of the Navajo, Hopi, Havasupai, Wallapai, the numerous tribes in this area that call this place home. And he asked Hufford to represent certain Navajo and Hopi elders that he knew. Now again, up to this point, 2 months, all Hufford had done is education law. That was his background. That was his legal training, was in education law. But he was the guy. He was the one that was there. So he said, "All right, I'm going to do this." And his first action was to help organize tribal appearances at public hearings. We all know today if the National Park Service, the Forest Service, they want to do something, they have to hold hearings, all these alternatives. That was a new thing back then with the passage of NEPA and EPA and all that. Hufford knew enough that he said, "Okay, there's public hearings, we need to go." So the first public hearing was on the Grand Canyon Master Plan. This is a pretty good map the Arizona Republic had. The dark areas are those proposed additions. And the thing is if you look, it's kind of hard to see, but the upper right-hand corner, that's Marble Canyon East. That's what they wanted to add that the Navajo were saying, no, that's not okay. Now, the Wallapai and Havasupai had issues with the middle dark places, the lower Kanab Canyon and the Mesa Cataract Canyon areas. Now, Hufford really didn't work with the Wallapai or Havasupai so much. Well, the Wallapai actually went to a meeting in Phoenix on May 15th of 1971 to register their opposition. Tribal Council Chairman Sterling Mahone main complaint was that expansion would kill hope of building a proposed dam. The Wallapai wanted a dam in the canyon. They wanted this because they felt it would put the tribe on a path to more economic security. However, they had some other issues. They felt this was going to be encroaching on their land. There was shrinking boundaries of their reservation and also take away access to the Colorado River. Now, at the hearing in Phoenix, there were about 200 people, and the only Native representation was from the Wallapai. 2 days later, there was a hearing right here on the South Rim, and this is where Ben Hufford brought the Navajo elders and other people from Tuba City to register their complaints. At this hearing, the Havasupai also appeared, opposed the expansion because they felt it would have encompassed grazing land that they had permits to graze their cattle on. The Navajo's main complaint, which was registered by Council Vice President William Skeet, was that the expansion would be, quote, a double standard which favors development by the National Park Service of land while reducing opportunities for the tribe to develop land. At this time, the Navajo actually had their own sites set on the Marble Canyon to make a tribal park. Okay, so these appearance of these Native speakers helped organized by Beaver and Hufford kind of set things in motion. Without these hearings on the Grand Canyon, again, most of my research is on the San Francisco Peaks and Flagstaff, but I found this, I was like, oh, well, that's different. This is a different part of the story than I had originally come in with. Without these hearings, what happens in Flagstaff throughout the rest of this decade, and what we even see today, would not have happened. So let me get to that part of the story. What you see here on the slide is in the red area is the proposed land that was going to be used for the Snow Bowl Village, I said. There's a red dash you can see kind of heading up to the peaks. So this was what we call, this was an inholding. If you're not familiar with the term inholding, it's privately owned land surrounded by federally owned land. In this case, the Coconino National Forest, run by the U.S. Forest Service. This was about 320 acres. Now the Snow Bowl, if you're familiar with that, it's run on National Forest Service land. It is not on private land and is run by special use permit. The whole thing tying this village proposal together for Bruce Ledbetter was, well, it's no good to have this resort village if they can't get to the Snow Bowl. And at this time, the Snow Bowl road was dirt. I mean, I've done the Snow Bowl road paved in winter. I don't like it. I could not imagine people trying to go there on a dirt road. So his whole fix for this, because there was an argument between the county and the Forest Service of who owns the road, who paves it, who does that. I'm going to build a ski lift, basically a tramway. And everybody in my village can just take this up to the Snow Bowl and then ride up to the top of the mountain. In order to do that, though, because the tram would go from private to Forest Service land, again, there had to be public hearings. Now, the first proposal for this, December 1969, right at the end of the year, this is when Bruce Ledbetter said, hey, this is what I want to do. It went to the county. County's like, we got to look at it. But there's back and forth with the county saying, well, what about water? What about this? We have to hear from landowners, things of that nature. Before the county could even decide anything, though, we have a U.S. Forest Service hearing on October 9, 1971. For my money, and for my defense I did yesterday, this is a huge date. This is one of the biggest dates, I feel, in the history of Northern Arizona, and nobody knows much about it. So we have this hearing, and there were indications, just based off of what happened at the Grand Canyon in May, that this was going to be pretty well attended. There was 55 total attendees, which may not sound like a lot, but for a public hearing in Flagstaff, Arizona in 1971, that's a pretty good amount of people. Among them were 11 members of Indigenous nations, 7 from the Hopi and 4 from the Navajo. Again, that doesn't seem like a lot. The importance of those 11, though, is in the historical record. And I keep saying this when I talk about this subject. The historical record, I mean, this is where it first appears. Now, there could have been people saying this privately or in different forums. But in the historical record, this was the first time that members of the Navajo and Hopi got up in front of the public and said, this is not okay with us. Just like on May 17, 1971, it was the first time they got up in front of the public and said, the Grand Canyon is part of ours too. Ben Huffer noted, quote, everybody knew that the tribes were there and then maybe people were there, but they hadn't taken account to their beliefs. So they knew. This wasn't new to Flagstaff residents that the mountain was sacred to these nations. In fact, when the Snow Bowl was first built in 1937, proposals for names for the ski area were Kachina Peak Ski Area, things like that directly referenced the sacred deities of the Hopi people. Through interpreters at this hearing, Hopi elders reminded listeners that the peaks were considered sacred by their tribes long before white men came to this area and were still considered so. Robert Lomotovsky, who is a Hopi and NAU student, insisted that those who supported development on the peaks had no idea what the mountains meant to indigenous people. Additionally, and this is where I say this is the big one, this is the first instance in the historical record in our whole area where tribal members straight said, we want to be a part of the voice of these mountains. Okay, they said, we want co-management of this area. After several more hearings were held by the Board of Supervisors who approved the Snow Bowl, legal action occurred. By the summer of 1972, DNA was already involved in the Friends of the Earth federal case about Rainbow Bridge. And on August 11, 1972, Ben Hufford and his partner Martha Ward filed suit in Coconino County on behalf of this man here, Frank Goldtooth Sr. Other people joining the suit were Jenny Singer and Earl Numhina. These were all either medicine men for the Navajo or elders of the Hopi tribe. After a year of tedious legal reckoning, which I'm going to gloss over, you'll thank me later, the lawsuits were decided. Development was halted, but Summit was allowed to restart the process. Basically, the judge said, yeah, you kind of fudged your zoning permits, so you have to start all over. This is still, though, even though, it's not a whole victory, this is still, if we're talking about the San Francisco peaks and court cases, this is the only instance in which development on or near the peaks was halted by the courts. If you're familiar with any other cases, Wilson v. Block, which came after, and then the more recent wastewater cases, every time the courts have said, okay, you can go forward. We're not going to worry about these things. And this brings me to the whole, what does it mean? Well, it's a short-lived victory because, as I just alluded to, in 1977, Summit finally said, we're done. There was a few more years of legal wrangling, and they said, we're out. They sold their land, they got out of the ski business, and they sold to Northland Properties. Northland Properties immediately said, we're going to expand the ski area. This starts the process all anew, and it leads to a federal case, Wilson v. Block. Federal because in the time period here in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. So this gave a federal avenue for tribes and other landowners to sue. Of course, later on, we have this, what we call the wastewater cases with Navajo Nation versus U.S. Forest Service, where they tried to attempt to stop Flagstaff from selling treated wastewater to make snow on the peaks. I always try to be a bit positive when I do these things, and I ask, is there hope? There's numerous things going on right now in our area where indigenous peoples are starting to get a say in at least co-management of lands that are sacred to them. We have issues at the Grand Canyon confluence where there is a proposal to build yet another dam, but Native peoples are saying that is a sacred site. This needs to be protected. Bears Ears in southeast Utah has been a site that, again, it's been in conflict, but just very recently, the 5 tribes that consider Bears Ears sacred, the Navajo, Hopi, Ute, Mountain Ute, and Zuni, have been given co-management of land. We have this very, very recent development with the ancestral footprints of the Grand Canyon National Monument. And I know some of these things aren't popular with the general public. But again, it's indigenous people saying, look, we can help take care of this land just as well as you. Let us have a say in it. And this all started 50 years ago with people saying, just let us tell you what we think about the peaks. And even now, after the devastating pipeline fire and other fires in Flagstaff last year, the city of Flagstaff is now actively consulting tribal members, asking about traditional knowledge to help preserve the mountains and their community. That's what it means. That's it. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.